Hello, I'm Gregory C. Allen, the director of the Wadhwani Center for AI and Advanced Technologies here at the Center for Strategic and International Studies. Today, we've got a terrific panel and keynote discussion about the African Union AI strategy and developments in the AI sector across the African continent. We're going to begin with a keynote presentation from Barbara Glover, who is a program officer at the African Union High-Level Panel on Emerging Technologies and the African Union Development Agency. She's one of the critical figures driving the work behind the AU-AI strategy, and she'll provide an update on that strategy now. Over to you, Barbara.
Good day, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Barbara Glover. I work with the African Union Development Agency and a program called the African Union High-Level Panel on Emerging Technologies, where my work is around supporting the panel's work through the Secretariat. I apologize for not being able to be with you in person today. This was due to a conflict in my schedules that was unavoidable. I, however, hope that you will find this presentation useful. So today I'm here to present on our ongoing work around artificial intelligence on the continent, and possibly also seek your inputs and thoughts based on a global perspective on some of our work in shaping regulations and policies on artificial intelligence. Now, the African Union Development Agency, for those of you who are not familiar with it, is akin to, within the UN system, the UNDP, which is the development program for the UN. So our work is primarily around supporting development across the continent. We have 5 mandates. Our first mandate is to coordinate and execute priority regional and continental projects. This is done in various fields, from science and technology to education, agriculture, food security, climate change, SMEs and entrepreneurship, among others. Our second mandate is to strengthen the capacity of our African Union member states and regional bodies when it comes to various issues around policy development and implementation. Our third mandate is to advance knowledge-based advisory support to our African Union member states and our regional economic communities. Emphasis is placed on our knowledge-driven approach, which is done through research and stakeholder consultations to ensure that policy development and implementation is backed by science and evidence. Our fourth mandate is to undertake resource mobilization for priority programs within our AU organs and policy instruments, as well as within our member states. Our fifth mandate is to serve as the continent's technical interface with our development partners and our stakeholders. Now, within the African Union Development Agency, we are working towards the Science Policy Innovation Nexus implementation. This is through 3 major components that we have identified. The first is science policy and enablers. This is where we have programs that are focused on policy that is driven by science and the enablers that support the implementation of these policies. We also have technology platforms where we test proof some of these recommended technologies and innovations at a perhaps much more reduced scale to ensure that they are viable for our African economies before they are recommended for rolling out. Our third is what we call the Energize Africa initiative. This is where we are looking at our youth, ensuring that anything that we are doing around science, innovation, and emerging technology supports African youth. Within these 3 components, we have identified some relationships. For instance, we are pushing for youth-driven policy interfaces, and we are also looking at youth-led innovation interfaces. We are also cognizant of the fact that policy and innovation have to go hand in hand to ensure effective implementation. Through this work, we sort of coordinate and ensure that we don't just release policies or regulations without looking at the evidence of science, looking at how viable they would be if they are implemented on the continent, and also without focusing on our youth, which are our major demographic. So why is science, technology, and innovation high on Africa's agenda? We have recognized that for our 50-year blueprint, which we famously call Agenda 2063, it has to be driven by science, technology, and innovation. To achieve that, we have developed a 10-year blueprint called the Science, Technology, and Innovation Strategy for Africa, STISA 2024. This is ending actually this year, and we are planning on developing the next 10-year strategy, looking at what our priorities as a continent when it comes to science, technology, and innovation, and how do we get to meeting these targets and aspirations that we have within our 50-year blueprint supported by science, technology, and innovation. Now, when you look at this map, you would identify that within the AU system, we have apportioned structures that are under decision-making and others that are under implementation. For the African Union Development Agency, which was previously called the NEPAD Planning and Coordinating Agency, our role is to be an interface with our development partners, our private sector, regional economic communities, our countries, and our specialized institutions and agencies. So whenever there's a policy or innovation that needs to be developed around science and technology, our role here is to conduct the research, to engage the relevant partners, and provide the necessary fodder or information that can support the decision-making structure. Now, once we have been able to formulate this, we then hand this over to our policy-making organs at the African Union Commission for adoption at the highest levels of the African Union structure, which is the assemblies of heads of states and governments. And this is the same methodology we have employed when it comes to the continental strategy for artificial intelligence. I've spoken previously about APET, so just to give you more context, the African Union High-Level Panel on Emerging Technologies was established in October 2016. It was previously chaired by Professor Callistus Juma of Harvard, who unfortunately passed away in 2018. It is currently chaired by Professor Yaye Kene-Gassama, who is a professor at the University Sheikh Anta Diop in Dakar, and was a former Minister of Scientific Research of Senegal. We have within the panel adequate representation when it comes to gender and regional allocations on the continent, as well as Africans in the diaspora and other recognized experts that have contributed significantly to science and technology on the continent. This is to ensure that every recommendation that comes from APET reflects various perspectives and is representative of African voices. So down to why we are having these artificial intelligence dialogues. We have three major objectives. Our first objective is to advance responsible AI. And this includes actually defining what responsible AI would look like in our African policy interface and ensuring that AI technologies are ethical, transparent, and accountable, and meets the expectations of our AU member states, as well as aligns to our continental values, our societal norms, and laws as well. Our second objective is strengthening the capacity of our policymakers and decision makers so they can effectively make policies and regulations around AI, and that enables our member states to utilize AI-enabled technologies more effectively in partnership with our private sector and our innovators. Our third objective is to address the myths and misconceptions on AI. This isn't a one-way communication approach. We also listen to the perspective of our member states to guide some of the policy recommendations that we develop around addressing myths and misconceptions on AI. We are part of a policy network called the AI4D, which is AI for Development, looking at policy research around AI to ensure that every recommendation that comes out of our work is backed by evidence and existing research. So giving you an overview of our continental strategy pillars, this you would find in our released AI white paper that I could share with the organizers for your consideration. There are 6 pillars within this strategy. The first pillar is on human capital development for AI. We understand as a continent that there is a need for capacity building and strengthening. We understand that our educational systems may need some level of overhauling. We understand that certain jobs may be overtaken by AI and there's a need for retooling and reskilling. Being cognizant of the limitations of our African settings. We are a continent of 55 countries with different socioeconomic development stages and interests, different social considerations and norms when it comes to the adoption of innovation and emerging technologies. And we are being cognizant of all that whilst looking at how we can shape our human capital to be ready for a future that AI plays a significant role in. Our second pillar is looking at infrastructure and data foundations and their use in AI systems. We're also cognizant of the fact that AI is driven by adequate infrastructure, which as a continent, we are aiming to be at par with when it comes to what is seen in other global scenes. We are looking at what are our energy needs and requirements as a continent and how can they also adequately address AI. Also cognizant of other competing challenges that we have on the continent. We are looking at some of our existing systems, some of the data centers that are available on the continent, and how they can be effectively utilized. We're also looking at our data governance framework, which was released by the African Union, and how this can be incorporated into harnessing technologies like artificial intelligence, the Malabo Declaration, and so many other frameworks that are looking at data protection rights of our citizens as well. Moving on to pillar 3, this is looking at our enabling environments for AI. Here we're looking at our policies, our regulations, IPs, anything that supports an enabling environment for artificial intelligence on the continent. We are looking at our legislations and even our societal norms and laws that may not be documented, but have an impact as AI transcends just a science and a technology to even our social life and how we look at and view things moving forward. Here we are looking at how to effectively regulate AI. What are the regulatory sandbox approaches perhaps that will be used? And how do we do that with understanding that we don't have a homogeneous system and there's a need to reflect various opinions and expectations? The fourth pillar, which we fondly call the money pillar, looks at AI economy. Here we're looking at investments for AI. In our engagements with our policy and decision makers, there's often the need to argue for the cost of doing nothing. What happens if a country doesn't invest in AI? What impact does it have on it? So here we argue for what are some of the economic considerations, and what will a country benefit when they invest into AI? When you engage politicians, they want to look at what are the low-hanging fruits. If I should invest in AI when I have a 4-year term to prove to my populace, for instance, that I'm here to do the work and serve them. So how do we argue for that? How do we see immediate returns on some of those investments, with the understanding that some have to be long-term in order to see fruit within our socioeconomic dividends? In pillar 5, we are looking at building sustainable partnerships. We understand that AI is so multi-sectorial and we can't limit it to one area. We can't also limit it to one region. We understand that there are global discussions around AI. So we also want to look at what are the global perspectives. Who should we be talking to? Who should we be engaging with without losing what is important to us as an African continent, without also losing the fact that we have unique challenges that we want to address as Africa. Our 6th pillar is looking at monitoring and evaluation. We do not want strategies that just sit on desks and are being told without measuring the impact, without having an understanding of what impact is it having on ground, what needs to change within the strategy. Our idea of this strategy is a living document that will constantly be updated, looking at the fast pace at which the technology is developing. So this gives you a fair idea of the pillars that we have considered around artificial intelligence when looking at a continental strategy. We have done this through active ongoing engagements, engaging with the private sector, engaging with our civil society, developing blogs and webinars around AI. We have also looked at our existing frameworks and incorporating some of these discussions into it. For instance, the African Union and the European Union have what we call the EU Innovation Agenda that is currently being rolled out. We also are in the process, as earlier mentioned, of developing the next 10-year science, technology, and innovation strategy for Africa. We want to ensure that these are all not frameworks that are mutually exclusive, but are frameworks that are talking to each other, because we want to ensure that we are moving in one direction as a continent when it comes to harnessing innovation and emerging technologies. We've had varied stakeholder consultations to gather diverse insights and perspectives. This is still ongoing. Our white paper, for instance, has been released, and we have a contribution form where we are receiving inputs from various stakeholders. We seek to identify unique challenges and opportunities in the African context around that. We've engaged key stakeholders from governments to academic institutions to our industry leaders, civil society, and also some international partners. And we still are in the process of engaging them in strengthening our thinking around a strategy for AI in Africa. This has been done through workshops and seminars, online surveys, feedback forms, focused group discussions, and also some public forums. An example being this meeting that you're listening to me on. In terms of the documentation for the strategy, we sort of started an awareness and engagement on it between January and February 2024. This is where we released our first drafts for inputs. The deadline for receiving inputs is the 31st of May 2024. We are currently gathering and analyzing some of the feedback that we have received on the white paper. We also aim to finalize and present this to our policy organs between June and July 2024. Our aim is to have a comprehensive strategy that reflects African voices, that documents our needs and aspirations as Africa, and to have with it a roadmap, a practicable roadmap for implementation and collaboration. You might be curious about our next steps in developing. For those of you that have had the chance to see our white paper, it's a 200-page document. It's comprehensive. It has lots of information based on our stakeholder consultations. But we also understand that in order to engage our policymakers, we can't go to them with a 200-page document. We also understand that there are different users of these documents, and it's important that we contextualize that in releasing a strategy around AI. So our next steps are in developing a compendium, which will be a digital platform for AI strategies for Africa. Within it, we want to include in the foundational AI concepts that looks at explanations of what really AI is, or what are the technologies around AI, the most basic latent approaches as possible to ensure a common understanding. We also want to include in the guidelines and frameworks for AI policy, including data protection, privacy, and some ethical considerations. We are also developing interest in developing sector-specific strategies around AI. AI for health, AI for education, AI for food security, AI for climate, highlighting the potential AI applications and the policy needs in those major sectors. We are also working on a digital readiness index to evaluate and enhance the preparedness of African nations for AI adoption, among other digital tools across the continent, so that it facilitates our targeted development efforts and resource allocation. We would include in that compendium case studies, successful AI implementation in Africa and even beyond Africa that our policy and decision makers can learn from to illustrate the practical applications of artificial intelligence. And then also have a resource directory that supports AI initiatives, offering a network of expertise that can also be tapped on. I hope that this has given you a clear idea of the work that we're doing and give you an understanding of where we intend to go as next steps. So here is my contact details. If you want to get in touch, you can also scan the QR code to connect on LinkedIn. Again, I apologize that I've been able to join you in person. I look forward to further discussions on this going forward. Thank you very much.
Well, thank you, Barbara, for that terrific update about the AU-AI strategy. We're now going to turn to our panel discussion about the AU-AI strategy and the broader developments across the private sector, academic sector, and public policy sector on the African continent with respect to AI. Our panelists represent those three sectors and have relevant expertise across all of them. So we're going to begin with Sheila Chadisima, who is the partner at NISC Capital and also a presidential appointee at the Kenyan National Investment Council. We've got Ni London Soa, who is a senior lecturer of computer engineering at the University of Ghana. And we've got Chinasa Okolo, who's a fellow at the Brookings Institutions and also an advisor to the group that is developing the AU-AI strategy. Thank you all so much for joining me today. To begin, I'd like to invite you all to just give a little bit more context about your background and your exposure to the AI technology in the African context, and also sort of how you found yourselves working in the respective AI sector. Sheila, if it's all right, I'd like to start with you.
Sure. Thank you, Greg. My name is Sheila Charisima, and I'm a partner at NISC Capital. NISC Capital is a boutique corporate finance and investment advisory firm. We're headquartered in Nairobi, and we cover 6 countries across East and Central Africa. I'm also the presidential appointee to the National Investment Council of Kenya. This is an advisory body that essentially supports policy design and around private sector investment, and just really advising the president on areas we see for opportunity in improving the private sector investment. I also sit on the board of directors for CIB Kenya, and this is a subsidiary of Egypt's largest private banks.
So thank you. Ni, over to you.
Hi, my name is Niland Nsoa. I'm a senior lecturer at the Department of Computer Engineering at the University of Ghana. Basically, I do research in artificial intelligence, working on a couple of projects. I had the chance to talk on various panels about AI research in Ghana, and here am I today. Thank you.
Thank you. And Chinasa, over to you.
Hi, everyone. I'm Chinasa Okolo. I'm a fellow at the Brookings Institution in Washington, D.C. And I recently finished my PhD in computer science at Cornell University. While there, I actually started some work with the African Union on developing the AU-AI Continental Strategy for Africa, which also complemented my research, examining responsible AI ecosystems throughout the continent, from startups to grassroots organizations, and then also recently started some work with the Nigerian federal government working on developing their national AI strategy.
Great, and thank you all for introducing yourselves. So we just heard from Barbara Glover an overview of the current state of the African Union AI strategy, but from your respective sectors and focus areas, I'd love to hear about what you think is the current state of AI on the African continent and the opportunities and challenges that it faces. So, and I'd also, to the extent possible, if you could sort of connect it to your own personal experiences, that would be great. So, Sheila, you had already sort of been ready to head in this direction, so let's start with you again.
Sure. So I look at this sort of from obviously the private sector lens, investment advisory business, and particularly with an East African lens, because I think oftentimes we make generalizations about Africa, but regions and countries, of course, are very different. So from where I sit, we see companies looking to incorporate AI, particularly around 2 main reasons. One is as a solution to infrastructure challenges, and I'll explain what I mean more about those infrastructure challenges. And then the second is a tool to sort of improve their business competitiveness in sort of the future of where we see just services and products going and how consumers will relate with them. So for example, when I look at the primary infrastructure challenges, one key area is around healthcare, right? Our doctor to patient ratios generally remain relatively low, and this is even worse in particularly remote areas, and can be very difficult for patients to have access to decent healthcare. So with AI improvements in diagnostics, we're seeing developments coming up in the healthcare space. This is a very active area where you see a lot of the application of data, of artificial intelligence. And it's really around diagnostics, the ability to use inputs from long distance and hold sort of virtual doctor-patient consultations with telemedicine. Of course, some economies are farther ahead on this, but we see a lot of innovation around that within the African continent. I think obviously some of the famous examples around healthcare, particularly like Zipline with the medicine delivery. But also, when I turn a little bit on sort of business competitiveness as well, we see this particularly sort of in tech and tech-enabled businesses. The fintech space is an interesting one, particularly for Kenya. So Kenya has been one of the countries that's been really ahead when it comes to the use of mobile for transactions and mobile for just access to financial products. So the use of this mobile data, and particularly mobile payments, which we use a lot when we're paying for services or for goods, this has been taken to the next level in terms of increasing the credit accessibility for a segment of the population that didn't have access to credit before. So you find, like in Kenya, banks like NCBA, they'll have platforms that they use for lending on the back of your transaction data, just studying how much you've transacted, who you've transacted with, or what businesses you've transacted with. So it's a very interesting metric around, if I can say, credit scoring, like the applications with credit scoring, with risk profiling, and with the ability to actually have financial inclusion for a segment of the population that traditionally would not have had access to lending because they don't fit sort of the traditional structure of having assets to back them to be able to access loans. So those are just some of the examples of what we see in terms of the spaces. We see, I talked about agriculture, fintech. We also, I talked about healthcare and fintech, and we also see there's quite a bit of opportunity within the agriculture space, particularly with all the arable land. And I'm happy to expand on that further.
That's terrific, Sheila, and we'll definitely come back to your examples on agriculture. I think it's interesting what you said about the opportunities for AI that deal with the unique context in African countries, such as dealing with the challenges of getting medical expertise broadly distributed, or medical care broadly distributed, or what you said about doing credit analysis in areas where traditional credit scoring techniques might not be as widely available. These are areas in which AI is sort of uniquely useful to solving challenges in the African context that I think are really interesting and, as you said, present some real investment opportunities. Nee, I'd like to go to you. We heard Sheila talk a little bit about the private sector on the East African context. As a lecturer at the University of Ghana, I'd like to hear a little bit more about what things look like in the academic and educational sector, and also on the western half of the continent.
Okay, thank you very much. So basically, in the field of academia, we have different professors, different lecturers doing research using artificial intelligence, like myself, right? I'm doing some research, trying to figure out how to use artificial intelligence to help with language translation, and also trying to use language translation, to help with large language models, right? I mean, a lot of the large language models that we have now are all basically in English, most of them, right? But how do we build a large language model and have a local language on top of that, so that local people who have challenges with English can still use it, to find whatever they need and all that, and want to do it using speech recognition functions, right? And so that's one of the research I'm doing. So basically, the AI landscape in Ghana is kind of scattered, right? So different people are doing different kinds of research. Sometimes if you meet someone maybe at a conference or something, you could share ideas, but there's not really a very centralized platform, right, for people to share what you're doing, except maybe at conferences and all that. But I think quite recently, in 2018, a few people came to form Zindi Africa. So Zindi Africa is the largest data science platform in Africa, right, where people share ideas. They run challenges on AI, data science, and analytics and stuff like that. And so Zindi is there, but I think more work needs to go out there, in academia.
Is Zindi the type of platform where folks post their data sets and then folks compete to perform data science on those data sets, or is it something different?
Yes. So it's quite similar to Kaggle. Kaggle, right?
Yes.
Yeah. So it's quite similar. So Zindi is like the Kaggle of Africa, if I should put it that way.
That's great.
So
you talked a bit about the research environment in Africa and how folks are focused on research to deal with languages and other sort of localized challenges. I'm curious if you could talk a little bit about the educational context. Are you seeing a lot of interest among your students in learning about AI and machine learning?
Yes. Yes. Our students actually learn about it to use it for their projects, right? Their capstone projects. We try to build AI-based solutions, right, in healthcare, in in security, in agriculture, and stuff like that. So I have a colleague actually. She's reading a PhD. She's trying to see how to use AI to detect, energy expended in people using their gait. So that's a research she's carrying out. I have students who are trying to use AI to figure out the differences between real images and then AI generated images for security purposes. So yes, we're using AI for research, and also students use AI for the assignments, right? We try our best to tell them at least to use AI just for generating ideas to solve the assignments themselves. So there are tools that we're able to use to detect when students use AI tools, for their assignments, for their homeworks, and for their projects. So yes, it's being used. It's a lot of AI is being used in the educational sector here. Yeah.
Terrific. Thanks so much. And now, Chinasa, I'd like to turn to you. Obviously, it's extremely difficult to try and summarize the entire African continent and what's going on in policy domains there. But we've heard a bit about the AU-AI strategy, which you have had some involvement with. I'd love to hear sort of your explanation about what is going on at the AU-AI strategy level, and then what is also going on at the national government level, and what you see as the most interesting policy developments in AI.
Yeah, definitely. So the AU-AI strategy, the process started around early or so in 2022, and actually I don't want to say wrapped up, but provided its first primary output in late February of 2024. And so just a few months ago. And so we're seeing lots of activity happen since then. Fortunately, right now for the AU-AI strategy, they're in like an open inputs phase. And so the goal is to have, I would say, the completed strategy by June or July of this year, and then hopefully present it to the heads of states at the next AU heads of state meeting that usually happens in late January, early February of next year. And so hopefully this will lead to adoption by AU member states. Unfortunately, we do see, I would say, a lack of enforcement capacity within the AU compared to regional bodies or structures like the EU. And so it's hard to I would say foresee if we'll see wide adoption across the AU member states, hopefully. But I would say like the activity that we're seeing across individual member states within the AU or the African continent have been also very promising. Countries like Rwanda actually have led in developing AI policies versus AI strategies. Rwanda's AI policy is actually the first AI policy on the continent. Other countries as well, like Benin, have focused on developing their AI strategies, in Senegal as well. In Northern Africa, I would say Egypt has also been a leader in this space and pushing out one of the first AI strategies, along with Mauritius as well. And so more recently, Nigeria also started the development of the AI strategy over the past week. They actually completed a draft in about 4 days or so. And so there's lots of, fast moving processes within AI strategy or AI policy that we're seeing on the continent. And hopefully we actually see these strategies turn into policies so we can ensure that, AI development and research and innovation is safeguarded and responsible, and it meets the needs of Africans.
So you mentioned safeguarded and responsible, which are terms that are typically associated with regulation and governance types activities. Is it fair to say that much of the government focus in Africa is thinking about in these terms about AI regulation, or would you say there's also a focus around investment and promoting adoption in these strategy documents?
Yeah, I would definitely say the focus is really on the latter, particularly as it pertains to leveraging AI for socioeconomic development. I think countries within Africa and also the global South more broadly are trying to understand how AI can be used to bolster their respective economies and also provide opportunities for youth and just, ways that they can increase or step up on the leaderboard of AI development. We've seen that, AI development right now has been primarily relegated to the US, the UK, EU, Canada, for example. And so African countries are, barely on the radar when it comes to, I would say like prominent machine learning models and also being primarily or prominently represented at top machine learning conferences around the world. And so I think that's, I see the focus of African countries focusing on that as well. Also, when it comes to just, the safe and responsible development of AI, I think that is also something that, Nigeria particularly has emphasized, and other countries throughout the continent have as well. I don't want to say that they're prioritizing this less, but I think the focus is really just on how AI can be leveraged to provide the best outcomes for the country as a whole.
Great. So the countries are thinking about simultaneously about responsible AI and safeguarding the population, but they're principally focused, as I believe I heard you say, principally focused on promoting adoption and investment in this sector. You also said that the competition for the most high performing models in the world is not something where Africa is principally focused, but more focused on the adoption and the use cases that are specific to the African economic and socioeconomic context. And for that reason, I'd love to turn to you, Sheila, to hear a little bit more about what you're seeing in the entrepreneurial ecosystem within, I guess in your case, primarily East Africa. What types of companies you're seeing and what types of problems are they tackling? And do you believe that AI is a meaningful source of competitive advantage for those firms that are choosing to pursue it?
Sure. I think the points that Chinasa also raised around this, just jumping off the, do you invest, do you regulate, how much should government invest, what is private sector doing? I do think sometimes the impressions, when there's something that you don't know very well, there's a fear of unknown, and there's a little bit of an effort that has to be done to debunk. And I think as the companies innovate and demonstrate, like some of the things you don't even realize that they're using AI already, right? It's somewhat this abstract concept, but actually if you look at your daily life, even within the African continent, you're already using AI. So a lot of what we see, and I think what entrepreneurs are trying to do, and I think what we'd love them to do is we are generally data providers, right? We provide data to big technology companies. We are technically data owners, but how this data is incorporated into these machine learning models, into these models, especially when it's done outside of the African continent, it's not contextualized. So how can it actually benefit the data providers if the context is missed out? So I think there's a bit of thought, and I'm kind of flipping between what we discussed from a policy angle and what I'm seeing in the business side, but there's a bit of thought of how can you then ensure that the contextualization of the input data that we provide will serve on the output end, the actual providers of that data. Now, when it comes from innovation, I'll talk about some companies. Let me give 2 examples of companies we've worked with, and let me switch to agriculture. Like obviously, a lot of our economies are still very agro-based, and we have a ton of arable land, right? So the ability to improve productivity and efficiency within the agriculture space is something that can be truly, truly transformative. And I think sometimes Africa as a continent and different countries, we've kind of pigeonholed, or we've been pigeonholed into how can you leapfrog every phase? You need to catch up. There's always a pressure of catching up, but to some degree, you can't skip certain phases. So there's a company that we're working with called All Agri AI, and they're looking at rice farming. I mean, rice, and they're using drones to do everything from sort of land tilling to fertilizer input to pest monitoring. They're able to use the drones to kind of determine where should you put what fertilizer and how much, and also just collect the data. So obviously in the beginning, it's a singular point in time, but over time, once that data can be applied to all time, there's a lot of large scale application, right? So if you take, that's just one area, but it's the use of already the drone technology and the collection of the data over a long period of time to be able to assess what exactly you can do within the rice farming space. And this can be applicable to other crops. And it's something that is needed. We need to study, the arable land has so much potential, yet that potential is untapped. So that's one area, a company we're working with that we've seen. Another company we've walked the journey with in Rwanda is actually, it started with just doing, it's a tap and go system, a public transportation payment system. So just digitizing the payments on public transportation. And they've gone from that to now, with all the data they've collected over time, and saying, okay, with the fleet that we have and the traffic nodes and the commuter times, how can we map the routes so that we get commuters to their destination in the quickest time possible at all points during the day? Now, they've been collecting this data for a long time, so it can allow them to do some of this route mapping. So some of the applications, now if you think about public transportation, right, that means there's a significant percentage of the population that interfaces with public transportation. Now, if you went and kind of had conversations with that same segment of the population in terms of what do they think about AI, it's like sometimes people think about the doomsday scenario. However, you're actually already interacting with that artificial intelligence. So how do we become not just data providers, but smart with our data, and how do we participate in the creation of these artificial intelligence models that will actually serve, responsibly, like Chinasa was saying, and I think Barbara said it too, for the actual consumers that provided that data and really suit the African context and the consumer context that we're working in.
That's terrific. And those are some really exciting companies and startups that you've been working with. I want to keep with you, Sheila, and ask you to put on your secondary hat, which is as a presidential appointee to the Kenyan National Investment Council. When the government gets involved in trying to promote investment in a sector such as technology, such as AI, what does it look like when this is done well? What are the pitfalls that governments can fall into when it goes poorly? What's the right way for policymakers to try and support investment in AI, for example?
That's a good question. I think obviously sometimes there's an inclination to say, how do we regulate, right? But I almost say, how are you regulating when you don't have, let the innovation first, have enough innovation, see what the trends are, and then figure out where to regulate. And people differ on this, right? Sometimes they're like, obviously, because the positive potential of AI is so tremendous, but the negative side can also be really bad. There's a push to say let's try and do these things in parallel. One area I think, so for example, when you talk to entrepreneurs and you just ask them, what are they using for their models, right? A lot of them are using cloud-based services. Cloud-based services already are not cheap, but it's very difficult for them to get physical machines that can process these large amounts of data into the country. And let's say they even try to get that, right, with the right financial backing, then there's a tax on top of it, right? It's just, as a government, if this is it's a new area that needs development, governments should be looking at how can we get these machines locally? How do we get them to our local researchers? How do we get them to our local labs? So that the input side is also really driven from a local context. I think that's one area, because right now it's very much cloud-based. And then if I think about another area you hear in terms of just challenges is energy, right? And there've been some thought, like not everything has to rely on the grid. I mean, we've also been very good at using text-based systems to kind of penetrate across the African continent and within East Africa as well. But the reality of it is, to process large amounts of data, you need a reliable grid. There are many countries, and even in East Africa, there are times when the grid is not reliable. So how do you then, if I think about the energy side and particularly infrastructure, I think as a government, we need to continue to support primarily the development of even renewable energy, right? So whether you're using on-grid or off-grid, the fact that you actually have an energy system that will be reliable for you to process these large amounts of data and to have the kind of internet connectivity and service you need, I think is an important one. So from that policy perspective, I think it's to look at what are the nodes of innovation and how can we support them? And are we supporting local innovation, or we are simply being sort of contributors within a bigger technology ecosystem? And don't get me wrong, I mean, the large tech companies, they're welcome to collaborate, but at the same time, what are we doing locally? We have great researchers locally. How are we equipping them locally to also be creating and innovating and collaborating with these larger technology companies, versus simply relying either on something they've already created or on the models they've already created, or giving them the data and having that data being processed in a way that might not necessarily fit the cultural context. I love what Nee was talking about with local language models. I think this is another interesting area. If you take a local language model and you don't understand the context of a word and use it within a machine for, to determine an application, you could be completely off, and the end user would not actually find value in the end product. So I think there's a lot of room. We've been contributors of data. I think we need to be more active in innovation. And from a government perspective, we need to support that, whether it's through supporting our researchers, whether it's through incentives from an infrastructure perspective to support infrastructure development, or just really around getting some of these machines into our economies and having the researchers get their hands on them.
That's terrific. And Nee, I want to turn to you to ask your perspective here, because as an academic, you interact with both the government community and also the private sector community. So beginning with the private sector community, I'd be curious to know, how do companies get involved with educators such as yourself at the University of Ghana working on this? And also, where do your students, when they graduate, where do they tend to go work when they're looking for jobs? Are they going to the entrepreneurial sector, starting their own companies or working at startups? Or are they finding larger multinational tech firms to work at? Please let us know. Sorry, you're on mute.
Sorry about that. Yeah. So yeah, a lot of my students actually work with startups. A lot of my students, when they complete school, they work with startups because we try to train them to be very good programmers, right? So right on when they finish school, they just work with startups. And then some also normally they have to work with startups for 2-3 years to build their experience in the corporate world, and then some of them go to grad school. Others also try to find employment with bigger corporations. What was the other question?
Well, and then I'd be curious to hear about the interaction that you have with policymakers. When you think about the types of policies that can support the educational development of an AI workforce. Number one, what do you see as the most impactful current policies, if there are any, that you would point to? And then secondarily, what would you like the government to do, both at the African Union level and then also at the local government of Ghana level?
Okay. So I think about a month ago, I was at a round table, right, organized by UNDP in Ghana. With policy, the entrepreneurs, and academia together, and we had a chat. And I was telling we have a data protection agency in Ghana, so I was telling the boss that academics have a lot of ideas, but sometimes unless we have someone putting us together, we don't really get to interact with those in government to know what they're doing and all that. And I was actually surprised to know that we have an AI policy which has been tabled at the Parliament of Ghana, right? And it's still there. I mean, they are yet to approve it. This year we have elections, so a lot of things are going on, on the political landscape in Ghana. And it's taking quite a while. They need to approve it. And she was talking about the fact that they want to have a responsible AI hub in Ghana to help with legislating, what can be done, what cannot be done, and all that. But all in all, I think policy-wise, it's a bit slow. The policy, coming up with AI policies and moving on is slightly slower than the development of AI in general around the world, right? And I was saying yesterday to another panel of UNDP and I was telling them that the way policy acceptance is slow, by the time the people in policy or people in government realize too much is going on with the populace, than, too much is going on that is faster, I mean, than the way policies are accepted, ratified, and all that. And so, all in all, I think policymakers are not moving in sync with the development of AI in Ghana. Yeah, they're not moving in sync. Yeah.
That's interesting. So the policymaking process is a little bit too slow, and the on the ground, more entrepreneurial developments are moving much faster. That's something that we see in many countries around the world. Chinasa, I'd like to turn to you to follow up on a little bit about what Nee said about the workforce opportunities and the workforce development opportunities and challenges facing the countries of the African Union when it comes to developing AI talent. So are there any elements of the AU-AI strategy in workforce development that you would highlight as particularly noteworthy, or is there something that you're seeing at the national level in some countries that's noteworthy?
Yeah, definitely. So I was fortunate to work on Pillar 1, which focused on human capital development for AI. within the AU-AI Continental Strategy. And so definitely also opportunities. I think for me, in particular, something that I highlighted or stressed within that section was focusing on improving just the education systems from the primary to tertiary levels. And I think there has to be a very strong focus on tertiary education as it pertains to improving or increasing the talent pipelines for AI and machine learning developers and researchers within and throughout the continent. Within the US in particular, we see that about 70% of AI or PhDs that focus in AI or in computer science in general are actually going into industry. And this may be or not be a good thing, but I think that there could be similar opportunities for the African continent. I was reading an interesting article yesterday that focused or analyzed the states of postdoctoral educational opportunities. And there are not a lot of that or a lot of opportunities for African and PhD level researchers to continue to gain that experience within the continent. And particularly, I can definitely say that when it pertains to AI, there's probably fewer opportunities as well. And so I think that is a really strong area of focus. And then also just in general, kind of going off of things that Nee has said previously is that, African countries and governments have to bolster, funding for research labs. Academic research has been fundamental to AI research and also innovation as well. And so although we're seeing that the focus on machine learning or AI development has gradually or actually largely shifted to industry over the past couple of years, academic innovators are still providing the basic and fundamental data sets and also the fundamental machine learning models that developers are leveraging in commercial AI models. And so for African countries, in governments to build feasible pipelines, this has to be a focus. And then also in general, there are basic educational, I would say, issues within the African continent, from basically in all the levels. I think that governments should also focus on providing free education to students and providing opportunities for equitable participation when it pertains to gender, to ensure that women and girls are also getting opportunities to be in education, and then also to equitably participate in STEM fields as well.
Great, thank you. And Sheila, I know one of the specializations of your firm is attracting sources of capital from the investment community, not just regionally in East Africa, but also internationally. And so I'm curious, what are your themes that you would identify from international investors who are interested in investing in Africa's technology scene? Number one, would you say that this is a growing trend? And then number two, if so, why?
So I think one of the things you have to debunk when you're dealing with technology and technology as it pertains to the African continent is that I think because of the way big tech has played out in North America or the US particularly, and to some extent in Europe, the mindset, people approach Africa like, what's that big company that's going to reach millions of people and make lots of money?
What is the Google of Africa or something like that, right? Yeah.
Right. And so part of it is saying, let's just find those companies that are doing mundane things and are using technology. And we're not looking at astronomical returns like you'd look at in North America, but they'll make you a good return, right? Because we're just in different phases in sort of our growth trajectory, and the consumer, the purchasing power, the consumer power, the middle class and upper middle class is smaller. There are all these dynamics that play into how big tech is able to operate in the US. And let's look at what companies are solving fundamental critical challenges that can affect masses of people, but the multiples might not look like what they look like in the US. And what am I talking about? In the US, it's like, and this is also because of my educational background and my familiarity with America, having spent, about 10 years there. You will solve for how can Greg get his Uber food really quickly, right? This is a thing and it can make millions of money. But we're looking at how can Greg get healthcare? Solve for a very fundamental thing. How do you get him to get basic diagnostic services? How do you get a larger part of the population to have access to credit? How do you capitalize on the arable land so that we can actually not only be producers of food for the African continent, but we can be exporters of food? So the challenges and what we're solving for is slightly different. So I feel like the starting place, given, at least for me, having both had the US experience and now being on the African continent, is to say, your starting point might be wrong. Let's reestablish what are your priors, right? And let's kind of update that to what's the reality of the ground. Now, there's a lot of opportunity with technology because all across the sectors, and there's many companies that have had to use technology just to sort of be competitive, and to also be competitive not only within a local context, a regional context, and definitely if you're looking globally. But at the same time, there's a fear of loss. We already have such high unemployment rates and high youth unemployment rates. So we have both youth who are coming out of these education systems and not finding jobs that fit the skills they've actually trained for, or they're underemployed. So that's already somewhat of a large crisis we need to solve for. So even when you're thinking about technology and we're thinking about where the areas of opportunity, you also have to think about which tech can actually even grow jobs, because we do need, or how can we reskill, right? Because we still have, at the end of the day, population, we have one of the fastest growing populations. And if you don't have meaningful work for them to do, that's a huge socioeconomic crisis. So when we're trying to do the investor matching, there's always the ask for where's the Google, where's the Facebook? And we have to say, it's not quite a Google or Facebook, but it's a pretty interesting company that will make you a good return. And you need to have the long game, right? And how do we think about supporting this company to potentially get out of the one country that it's in and do sort of regional work or do global work? And so a big part of it is saying, stop looking at Africa for the next big whatever. There are some, I mean, you know, there's like Flutterwave that came out and it was a unicorn and it's done very well. And there's examples like that, and they will be there. But I think initially the mindset is to come and say, what's the big thing? And I'm looking for that big thing. And our philosophy is that there's many, you know, sort of somewhere in between, like bulk a couple of those, and some of them might turn out to be big or not, but they will make a return. And so that's what we try to do with sort of our investor matchmaking, and the opportunity and the utilization of technology across sectors. I talked about sort of logistics and transportation. I've talked about healthcare. I've talked about agriculture. You find it almost anywhere, even now with financial services and credit scoring. So there's large opportunity, and it's just kind of reframing or rethinking about the approach that the investors coming to the market with.
Great. And then one of the things that we're interested in here at CSIS and are also interested in the context of the African Union AI strategy is what are effective ways to partner internationally. And so I'm curious, you know, if you were advising the United States or the G7 or whomever, you know, what's the right way to get involved with the African Union AI strategy or the other types of developments that are occurring across the African continent, whether that's the entrepreneurial AI activity or the budding research community in AI? What would be the most effective way for the international community, whether that's the UNDP or the G7 or USAID or even just the State Department? And Chinasa, if it's all right, I'd love to start with you.
Great. Yeah, so I think there's already a lot of this engagement happening, fortunately. For example, for last week's workshop, it was sponsored and partnered, UNESCO and UND partnered with the government of Nigeria to help facilitate this workshop, and along with other big tech companies like Meta, Google, and Microsoft. And so I think we're seeing a lot of this engagement happen. I think in terms of representation on large international stages or organizations or bodies or meetings, I think that there is a lot of progress to be made. I think really just like reaching out, to governments and also, actors in this space, like Barbara, for example, would definitely be a good start. Barbara has mentioned in our meetings that, there has been a lot of inbound, from tech companies in terms of how they can help develop the AI strategy and then also, or just support in general. And so I think that this is a good start. I would say in other ways, we've also seen a lot of tech engagement on the continent in terms of actually building up research labs. So for example, Google AI in Accra, Ghana launched a couple years ago. And then also the Microsoft Africa Research Institute launched in Nairobi also a few years ago, maybe about 2 years ago or so. And then also IBM has had a big presence within the continent in Nairobi and in Johannesburg for almost a decade now, I believe, or so. And so we're seeing a lot of progress made. I think there also needs to be space given for, local initiatives and startups to grow. We're seeing this through examples like Lalapa AI, based in South Africa, that, you know, some of the founders were actually were involved and helped bring Masakane, the NLP, or Natural Language Processing Research Group, up. And so they've been prominent and improving this ecosystem throughout the continent as well.
Yeah, Lalapa AI, notably, you know, one of the most prominent developers of large language model technology coming from the African continent, which is exciting. But I'm delighted to hear, you know, you're recounting about how American and international tech firms are involved both in investing in Africa, but also investing in workforce development and research development in Africa. I think there's a lot of enthusiasm around the AU-AI strategy and some of the developments that are occurring across various countries. Nee, I'd be curious to get your perspective on the same question. You know, when you see international engagement, what is effective? What would you like to see more of?
Okay, so yesterday I had a meeting with some people about AI, and I think what I really want to see is a lot more AI advocacy in Africa. What do I mean by that? Look, when we have AI meetings and stuff, it's all about tech people, fintech people. What about the masses? That's the question. What about the masses? People in the market, people, the ordinary person who doesn't have much idea about tech, you know, who's not a tech enthusiast, who's not policymaker, who's not into academia, who's not an entrepreneur, just an ordinary worker. You know, how do we get them involved? And I was saying that imagine having, like, in every African country, right, having like the top musicians having a music festival, 30,000, 40,000 people, and you just have a 10-minute slot to talk about AI, its power, how people can harness it. That is the masses. As it stands now, a lot of people is just 500 people in the room, 200 people in the room, maximum maybe 1,000 people. You understand? What about having a live concert, or like finding ways and means of reaching out to the masses through, you know, entertainment, you know, avenues and stuff like that, in a sports game or something? You know, either we having advertisement about AI, or during maybe the break, right, having a two-minute, you know, advertisement about
and
AI.
I assume you're thinking there primarily about the educational opportunities associated with AI. Is that fair to say? Yes,
educational, and, you know, letting more people know about it, letting more people know about how they can access it. And of course, like Sheila said, a lot of people are using it, but they don't even know that they're using AI.
Yeah.
You know, it's abstract to a lot of people. And so for me, I think that's where I really want you know, foreign partners to push. Let's advocate more. Yeah.
Great, thank you, Nee. And I'd like to give the last word to Sheila here. And I'd be curious, you know, when you see international involvement, whether that's from big tech or from international governments, what tends to work well? What tends to be effective?
I think when they're very thoughtful about local context, and sort of whatever product or service they're building, whatever engagement, and they approach it from the perspective of what is actually needed in the community, and they localize. Because you have some firms that will come in and bring in a lot of foreigners, and we're happy to have foreigners, but at the same time, if you're working on like fundamental community-oriented solutions, you need to have the inputs within the community. You need to be localized to the extent that the Google office in Kenya should feel Kenyan. The Google or the IBM office should feel Kenyan, because you should be working on very Kenyan problems, right? Because there are a lot of problems to solve within the Kenyan economy or across East Africa. So I think in the partnerships, to the extent that they localize well, we see that tends to work better. And we've seen this across the board, outside of the large companies, even with just in the financing space, right? We have some firms or funds that have a lot of foreigners, but that local nuance, when it's lost, it becomes very difficult for you to have a meaningful impact locally, and also for your firm to do well. So it goes both ways. So I think there's an aspect of localizing and understanding, or trying to solve the problem from the perspective of whatever community or country that they've come into or that they've partnered with. And from a government perspective, I think it's going away from this idea of, I will support you with this if you do this. Again, it has to come from what are your gaps as a government? Where are you looking to grow? Where do you need support? And how can we have a mutually beneficial relationship that would support the particular economic development transformation agenda that you have as a government, and not, because we've had historically, and there are circumstances where the terms of support come with demands that might not necessarily be a priority for that government. And I think probably President Kagame has been one of the strongest advocates for saying we will sit together and have partnerships on our terms that work for us locally, not terms that work for you. And if you're not open to that kind of partnership, then you're free to walk away. So I think there's a little bit of and it's a needed shift, and there's a need for reframing of those bilateral relationships with Africa, where it's not dictated, be it within the private sector or within the policy or public policy, but it's on the basis of the needs, localized needs, the prioritization of those needs, and really looking to solve them from the perspective of the local communities and the local consumers within the specific countries.
Terrific. Well, Sheila, Nii, and Chinasa, thank you so much for spending this time with us and sharing your expertise and insights about what's going on with the African Union AI strategy and AI on the African continent. I certainly learned a great deal and very much appreciate your contributions. This concludes our event, so thank you all for joining, and stay tuned at csis.org, where we'll continue our work on African AI policy and AI policy in the international context writ large. Thank you.